Hello, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome. In this video, I'm sharing another of the cards I created using some of the new stamps and stencils from the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous 2024 Christmas release, and that Tim shared during his YouTube Live. I had so much fun creating this wintry scene with Mr. Frostie. As always, feel free to use any supplies that you already own. However, if you're interested in the specific products I'm using, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. Click on the word more to see more. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I appreciate that support so very much. So on this card, I'm going to be working with the new Frostie stamp set from Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous, which is part of his Christmas 2024 release. And then the stencil I'm going to be using is a Sparkle Fade from Mini Set 62. The other supplies I'm going to be using is some embossing ink and white embossing powder, permanent black ink, this is archival ink and black soot, and then some distress ink and Stormy Sky and old paper. And then also some distressed watercolor pencils in fired brick, peeled paint, spiced marmalade, lost shadow, and black soot. And if you don't have the watercolor pencils, you could use colored pencils or other watercolor pencils. You could also take your distress inks and put them onto the craft mat and use a water brush or a paintbrush to pick up the ink with a little water and paint with those. You could use distress reinkers as well to paint with. Or even just regular watercolors. So lots of options for that. So the paper I'm going to be working on is distressed watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to start off by actually stamping my image and kind of creating my focal point for the card. And I usually don't go in that order when I'm stamping. I usually create a background and then do the embellishing. So this is just, wanted to try a little something different this time. And I think part of that is based on the fact that as soon as I saw the snowman, I definitely wanted to make him the focal point of the card. So, yeah. So here I'm just stamping that larger snowman Frosty image with some black soot archival ink. So it's just a waterproof ink, and I'm going to stamp that a couple times just to get a really nice impression there. And then I'm going to leave that paper and everything in my stamping platform here and just kind of get my magnets in place, make sure everything stays where it is so that it doesn't move. And then I'm going to do some coloring here with my watercolor pencils. And I like to pull the pigment off of the watercolor pencil just using my water brush, and then I can just kind of make sure that water's flowing good, and then I can use that to just kind of color in that image. Like I mentioned, you know, there's lots of options of different mediums that you could use to color with. You could also use Copic markers if you're into coloring with those. So just lots of options on how to add a little color to an image. As you can see, I'm kind of coloring over the whole thing, and just because I want to get the black soot onto those lighter areas that are kind of the highlighted areas, because the black soot's not a super dark black, as you can see. It's kind of a light black color, so it will act as a nice kind of highlight there. And now we're just going to take the spiced marmalade, add a little color to his nose. And then just, you know, using a little paper towel to kind of clean things off in between. And I'm going to use the peeled paint for his scarf. And I add a little red to the band here. This is the fired brick. And then I'm going to use the Lost Shadow to add a little bit of color to the buckle. And then I'm going to use it to add just a little bit of some highlights to Frostie. So kind of adding that Lost Shadow to the areas where there's like a little bit of a shadow area here. And kind of use the water to blend that out a little bit if you need to. And I think I'm going to add a little bit of that black soot here to the eyes. Okay. And then we'll give that a quick dry with the heat tool. All right, so we have our coloring done, and now because we haven't moved anything, we're going to re-stamp our image. And stamp over that again. And as you can see, it just really makes that image just pop a little bit more with that re-stamp after you've done the watercoloring. And from here now I'm just going to take my scissors and kind of fussy cut around the snowman, but I'm going to kind of leave a little bit of an area here a little bit longer, because what I'm going to do is kind of use that area to put like a little strip for my sentiment. So anyway, so I'm just going to trim around this and go from there. So I finished fussy cutting the snowman, and now we're going to move on to the background. All right, so now I'm going to work on the background, and this is just a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock that I've cut down to 4 by 5¼ inches. And this is partially why I wanted to go ahead and make my embellishment, because what I want to do is some stamping with these snowflakes from the Frostie stamp set. And I kind of wanted to make sure that as I stamp them across the background that you would see them behind Frostie here. So, and then I'm also thinking I'm going to do, one of the sentiments here. So I'm going to kind of think about how that would like be on there as well, so that I can kind of center things a little bit. And again, just kind of figure out how I want the snowflakes to kind of float across the background here. So kind of play with that, around with that a little bit, and get an idea for that. So I think what I'll do is kind of stamp those 3 like that, and then I'll repeat and stamp another 1 or 2 down here a little bit lower, just to kind of continue those snowflakes across the background. So I'm going to stamp these images with some embossing ink, and you can use any embossing ink that you have. Those images, and then I'm going to pull this out here, and then I'm just going to use some white embossing powder to emboss these. So just going to sprinkle that across here. Tap off any excess. And then I'm gonna put this back in the jar. And then I'm going to use my heat tool to heat emboss these. And I'm just going to put this back in here and then stamp, re-stamp these images here again. I can pull my little Frostie back in if I like, just to kind of make sure I have things where I want them. And then just re-stamp those and heat emboss them, just like we did the first ones. Now, if you want to add some more snowflakes to this, you could certainly then start doing some stamping where you're kind of stamping off the edges here a little bit. And I think that could add a little fun element to this, a little more interest. And just kind of stamp in some of these open areas here. So do a little bit of that. So then you just can continue repeating this process until you're happy with how your background looks with the snowflakes. All right, so there is a look at the embossed snowflake background. And now we're going to continue on to the next step. So now we're going to take the Stormy Sky Distress ink and do a little bit of ink smushing. And I'm just working on a non-stick craft mat. That's just kind of a personal preference. I like the way the ink kind of beads up on here, but you could certainly do this on the glass mat as well. And then we're just going to spritz that with some water, and then we're going to just smush the paper into the ink. Just kind of rotate it around until we kind of get the ink on there as we like. And I try to kind of dab in a new area each time so that it's not kind of going back over and the same spot with more of the same wet ink. So by doing one layer at a time and then drying it, you can build your layers of color. So now I'm just going to give this a quick little dry with my heat tool. And if you don't like these little small little dots here, you can tap away at them before you dry them. If you don't like those, but I like those little speckly dots here and there. And then once you have it mostly dry, if you want to take a paper towel and kind of dab dry anything, just give it a second to cool off before you put the paper towel on it, or it will stick, because the embossing powder will kind of get sticky with the heat. So I'm just going to tap that off, and then you can kind of lay your little Frostie on there and see, if you think you want that a little bit darker or more color. So just dab back into the ink you have on your craft mat and continue building those layers. And if you need a little more ink, just add a little more and some more water and go at it. So like there, if you don't want those little dots, you can get rid of them. And then we'll give that another dry. And so then as you can see, those layers just start continuing to build as we add that color and then dry it and then add it again and dry. So you can continue repeating that until you're happy with how it looks. Now another option for the background, like if you didn't want to do the ink smushing, you could also take your ink pad and a blending brush and just do some ink blending that way and add your color to the background that way. So now we're going to take that little sparkle fade stencil, and I'm just going to position that here over the background and add a little bit of that stormy sky through the stencil. And I always think it's so fascinating how you can layer the same color and get a darker. Isn't that pretty? You can still see that. So add a little bit of that sparkle to that side, and then just kind of move the stencil around here and get some up over in this corner. Go, and it's a little bit down here. And a little bit over here. So, and then if you wanted that darker still, like you could just take the stencil and you know, line it back up again and apply a little more ink, and it's just going to get darker and darker. So you can see there, set a little bit darker there. And the last thing you can do is just take a paper towel and just give it a little spritz. And then I'm just going to lightly wipe over the top of this just to remove any ink that might be on top of my snowflakes, which there's really not that much. And then that is a look at the finished background. And there's going to be our snowman on top of that. And then we're going to add a sentiment strip. So next thing we're going to do is create our sentiment strip. And for that, I'm going to take some old paper distress ink and just do a little ink smooshing with the strip of some distress watercolor cardstock, just to kind of give it a little bit of an aged vintage look. So I'm just going to smush that in and then give that a dry. And then again, you can just repeat that ink smooshing as much as you like until you're happy with how it looks. All right, so now we're going to take that strip and just stamp our sentiment onto it here, and just going to kind of center that. And stamp that with some black soot archival ink. And then from here, our card is kind of ready to assemble. What I'm going to do is just kind of trim off some of this excess. And then I can layer that across the bottom on my card. And then I think what I'm going to do as well, I'm going to grab a little vintage photo distress ink, and I'm just going to ink the edges of my strip here just to get a little more vintage vibe. And if you want to give your Frostie a little more vintage vibe, you can ink the edges of him as well. It's kind of really up to you. You might not want to add any of this, which is obviously totally fine. And then I'm going to do a little bit around the edges too of my background here. Usually kind of can't resist a little brown inking around the edges, especially with vintage photo, which has always been a favorite color of mine. All right, so then, yeah, so there we go. here's a look at the finished card. Before I adhered Mr. Frosty and the sentiment, I added a little bit of distressed spritz and weathered wood to the background and some splatters. So I spritzed the background, and then I also added some little splatters by just tapping the nozzle over the paper, and just to add a little bit of shimmer to the background. Definitely easier to see in person than it is on the video here. But the other thing I did was add a little bit of machine stitching around the outer edge as well. And then I adhered everything to a piece of black cardstock. And then with the sentiment here, I ended up tearing the edges and distressing the edges a little bit, just to give it a little bit more of a vintage look. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this card came together using some of the new Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous Christmas 2024 stamps and stencils. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.